Welcome back to Sleepy Chronicles. Tonight, we're asking what it truly meant to live as a medieval peasant. We'll set aside the storybook version for the quiet, practical world beneath it. Lie back and get comfortable. If you enjoy quiet voices and slow history, take a moment to like and subscribe. It costs nothing and means a lot. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. We'll take it from here. A gate creaking on leather hinges as someone slipped through it, still half asleep. A peasant's shadow stretching long across the yard before the sun had properly cleared the tree line. Dew soaking through worn boots, cold enough to sting. Smoke rising thin and gray from a low, patched roof, marking a household already awake. Two things were true of a medieval peasant's year at once. It was ruled entirely by forces no one could control, and it was one of the most disciplined, self-organizing systems of labor ever practiced. Neither fact canceled the other out. Late summer decided everything. By the older reckoning, the first day of August marked when the earliest grain was ready to cut, and a village then had roughly 6 weeks before weather reliably turned against it. 6 on a good year, and everyone in the fields knew the number. So here is the real question worth sitting with. What actually happened if a storm arrived in week 4 instead of week 6? A modern worker complains about a demanding week and looks forward to the weekend on schedule. A medieval household had no such promise. Rest came when the harvest allowed it. Nobody clocked out. The answer decided who ate that winter. A crop left standing too long in wet weather would sprout in the ear or rot at the root, with no second planting behind it. The community worked as a single unit. A manorial official known as the Reeve, a villager elected to organize labor for the Lord's land, coordinated who cut where, since a field half finished was worse than one not started. Rope biting into palms as another sheaf was bound. A dull ache in the lower back. Sweat stinging the eyes, wiped away with a caked wrist. The rasp of a whetstone during the one pause anyone allowed themselves. One protection did exist, and it mattered more than it sounds. After the main cutting, the poorest villagers held a recognized right to glean, to walk the stripped field and gather whatever grain the harvesters missed. This was not charity. It was closer to law, upheld by local custom courts, because a village that let its weakest starve lost workers it needed by spring. Winter told a different story. Once the fields lay bare, the pace eased, tools repaired by firelight, wool spun, livestock watched for illness. Urgency and release, the same quiet threat every year. Fall behind in August, and the household paid for it by February. Most peasants lived, worked, and died within a stretch of land walkable in an afternoon. A cottage, a strip of field, a well, a church, the geography of a lifetime. This did not mean isolation. A passing merchant with news of a battle kept the wider world within reach. But daily knowledge lived closer to home. A household could usually guess whose animals had wandered off, or whose roof still leaked. And this is the part that surprises most people once they hear it. This closeness was not just social, it was legal. Villages operated under frank pledge, binding small groups of households to answer for one another's conduct. If a crime occurred and the culprit fled, every household in that group could be fined for failing to raise the alarm. A duty called hue and cry, requiring anyone who witnessed wrongdoing to shout and summon the village at once. A modern neighbor might wave from a car window and know nothing else about the house next door. In a village bound by frank pledge, that distance was against the rules. A latch lifting without a knock, a pot pushed across a threshold, still warm, boots left muddy by a door not their own, a name called across a fence before the question finished. That kind of closeness cut both ways. A sick household could expect help within the hour, but a mistake could follow a family for a generation, remembered by everyone, forgotten by no one. Nobody wrote the emotional side of these boundaries down. That part was drawn by how far a story could travel on foot before the next season demanded attention, and by a small, well-worn tool a family kept passing hand to hand, as if the land needed reminding who it belonged to. Urgency and stillness, taking turns. That was the frame a peasant's year lived inside. A world small enough to know completely, never quite safe. The scrape of stone against stone, back and forth, before the sun was properly up. A low ache already settling into a shoulder that hadn't rested since yesterday. The smell of tallow and cold ash from a fire banked overnight. Somewhere close, a wooden bowl set down hard on a table. How old could a body feel by 30, when every day since childhood had asked something physical of it, old enough that archaeologists studying skeletons from parish cemeteries sometimes double-check the estimated age against the damage in the joints. One particular pattern shows up again and again in the bones of medieval women, a distinct wear mark on the wrists and forearms, caused by years of grinding grain by hand between two stones. The motion was repetitive, forceful, and daily, and it left a signature in the skeleton that researchers can still read centuries later. A body did not need an accident to be permanently changed by this life. Routine alone was enough. A modern person might schedule a rest day after a hard workout, sore and satisfied, knowing tomorrow brings recovery. A medieval body rarely had that luxury. Soreness was simply the next day's starting condition, absorbed and worked through. Physical labor left its mark early elsewhere too. A person in their 30s might already carry stiff joints and a curved spine that a modern office worker would not expect until much later in life. This was not weakness. It was accumulation. Years of lifting, bending, carrying, and standing translated directly onto bone and muscle. The way a river slowly carves a channel into stone, a shoulder rolling to loosen before the next lift, a grip tightening around a worn handle, palm calloused past feeling it, a knee cracking faintly on the way into a crouch, breath catching, then steadying before the next row began. Strength itself was not admired for its own sake. It was simply a requirement, checked constantly and without ceremony. There was no separate category for exercise because the work itself never stopped demanding it. Accumulation, not accident. That toll on the body was only half the picture. The other half lived closer to birth and death than most modern lives come. Consider this, and it tends to stay with people once they hear it. The word gossip itself comes from this room. It began as godsib, literally a godparent or close spiritual kin, and came to mean the small circle of women a mother chose to have present at her birth. Those women stayed for days, not hours, talking through the long waiting, and the word for their company drifted over centuries into meaning idle talk itself. A modern parent might spend months choosing a hospital. Confident help is one phone call away. A medieval household had only the women already there, and whatever they had learned living through it themselves. A hand pressed flat against a swollen belly, feeling for movement. A cloth wrung out and pressed to a fevered forehead. Fingers working a poultice into a torn palm by firelight. A low murmur repeated under the breath, over and over. Knowledge passed this way, hand to hand, mattered more than any written manual, because most households own none. A handful of herbals did exist, copied slowly by monasteries, but ownership by an ordinary family was almost unheard of. Infant death was common enough that it shaped how families approached early childhood. This was not coldness. It was protective realism, learned the hard way over generations. Folk medicine filled the space where formal doctors rarely reached. Everyone relied on herbs gathered at the right season and remedies tested quietly over years until they worked or were abandoned. Picture a household keeping a small bundle of dried herbs above the hearth, replenished every autumn without discussion, because nobody wanted to find out what happened the winter it was forgotten. None of this meant peasants viewed their bodies as disposable. A body that worked was the difference between a full winter store and an empty one, which made physical health a matter of survival, not vanity. Illness in a working adult could mean a household's plans quietly falling apart. What often goes unnoticed is how much of this knowledge, medical and otherwise, left no paper trail at all, not because it wasn't real, but because it was carried somewhere sturdier than paper, in hands, in memory, in the body itself. The clack of a wooden spindle knocking against a stool leg. A basket of wet wool set down with a soft, heavy sound. Somewhere near the door, the scrape of a hoe being wiped clean before it went back to its corner. A draft moving low across a dirt floor. Picture a household as a single machine with several moving parts, none of them optional, none of them idle. That is closer to the truth than picturing one person working while everyone else waited around. Labor divided by age and ability, not by idleness. A grown man might handle the heaviest field work, plowing, carrying, repairing whatever animals or weather had broken. A grown woman often managed the garden, the animals kept close to the house, and frequently the selling of surplus at market, which meant she understood the household's finances as well as anyone in it. And under a legal status English courts called feme sole, a married woman trading independently could sue and be sued in her own name, entirely separate from her husband's debts. Children were not spared for the sake of childhood. A 6 or 7-year-old could already be gleaning grain or minding poultry, because a household with an idle child was wasting a resource it could not afford to waste. What happened, though, to a household that had no spare hands at all, no children yet, no elders left? A modern household might divide chores by preference, or argue over who forgot to take out the trash. A medieval household had no such flexibility. If the animals went unfed, everyone went hungry together. It fell behind, quietly and immediately. There was no neighbor obligated to fill the gap, only the informal expectation that one eventually would, because next year the shortage might belong to someone else's roof instead. A spindle turning steadily between finger and thumb. A hoe striking stubborn soil again and again. A small hand reaching to gather fallen grain before it was lost in the mud. A kettle lifted off the fire just before it could scorch. I'll admit this is the part that tends to surprise people most when they first hear it plainly. There was no single breadwinner and no single job title that defined a person. No single breadwinner, no single job title. That division of labor happened inside a home that would surprise most people today for how little it offered. A single-room cottage, often shared with the animals that provided milk or wool, was common. Walls were commonly wattle and daub, packed mud, and woven branches, patched every autumn against the coming rain. And villagers held a recognized right called estovers, permission to gather wood from common land for fuel, repairs, and fencing, without which no roof stayed sound through winter. A modern homeowner expects a bedroom, a kitchen, and a lounge, each with its own door. A medieval household had one room for everything, and everyone adjusted around it, smoke curling low along the rafters before finding a gap to escape through. A hand reaching for a bowl already familiar in the dark. Straw bedding rustling as someone turned over. A goat shifting its weight near the door. Privacy, in the way we understand it now, barely existed. Sleeping space was shared, often by the whole family, and sometimes the animals as well. And nobody considered this strange, because nobody had ever known anything else. A visitor from today might find it claustrophobic. For the people living it, it was simply what a home was. Food followed the same practical logic as everything else in the home. A pot hanging over the fire might simmer for most of a day, absorbing whatever the season and the garden had provided: grains, beans, onions, whatever fortune allowed. Meals were rarely elaborate. They were dependable, which mattered more than variety ever could. What strikes me most, looking closely, is how little separation there was between working and living. The workshop, the kitchen, and the bedroom were often the exact same room at the exact same time. Nothing was set aside purely for comfort, because comfort was not the point. Function was. And yet within that crowded, smoke-filled room, a household still organized itself with real precision. Who slept where? Who worked what? Who ate first when food ran short? None of it was written down. Everyone simply grew up knowing it, the way a hand knows its own grip without ever needing to be told twice. A hand shading eyes against a low sun, scanning a line of clouds building in the west. The dry rustle of standing grain, still a shade too green to cut. A dog barking once, twice, then falling silent. Somewhere, a gate left open just a little too long. A single bad season was never just an inconvenience. It was the difference between a full winter and an empty one, decided by weeks that nobody could control. And everybody had to survive regardless. A good harvest meant seed set aside for spring, rent paid without borrowing, animals fed through the cold months, and a little left over in case anything went wrong later. A poor harvest collapsed all of that at once. Grain meant for planting eaten instead, which meant next year was already in trouble before it began. Weather was the threat nobody could argue with. Too much rain rotted grain before it could be gathered. Too little left it thin and stunted. A hailstorm at the wrong week could flatten a season's labor in an afternoon. With no insurance, no replacement crop, and no authority to appeal to. But here is what almost nobody expects. There usually was an authority to appeal to, just not for the weather. Local officials enforced something called the assize of bread, a regulation tying the price of a loaf directly to the cost of grain, recalculated at set intervals, so a hungry season couldn't quietly become someone else's windfall. Violations were punished publicly. A fine at best, a spell in the stocks at worst. Enough humiliation that most who profited from scarcity thought twice before trying again. A modern shopper facing a bad crop year somewhere in the world barely notices. Shelves stay full. Prices shift slightly. Life continues. A medieval household living through the same bad year faced it directly, with nowhere else to turn for grain, eyes lifting again and again to a darkening horizon. A hand testing a stalk of grain for the give that meant it wasn't ready yet. A held breath as the first drops of rain began to fall. A door pulled shut against wind that smelled like more was coming. Hunger, when it came, did not arrive suddenly. It crept in smaller portions, thinner pottage, hard choices about which animals to slaughter early and which to keep for breeding. Some households mixed ground peas or even bark into their bread flour during the worst stretches, a detail that rarely makes it into simpler retellings. Picture standing at the edge of a field, grain rustling underfoot, counting days left against a season that would not wait to be asked. That was the real work of a bad year. Not just the labor, but the waiting. That fragility is exactly why the second half of this matters so much. Nobody survived scarcity entirely alone, no matter how it might look from the outside. Debt ran through village life constantly, and it carried none of the shame it sometimes carries today. Borrowing seed after a bad spring was ordinary and expected. What mattered was repayment once luck turned, because next year the roles might reverse. Many households kept track of exactly this kind of debt using a tally stick. A piece of wood notched to mark an amount owed, then split lengthwise so lender and borrower each held a matching half that could never be secretly altered, only matched again when the debt was settled. A modern person might quietly avoid asking a neighbor for help, worried about seeming weak or owing something they cannot repay. A medieval villager had far less room for that pride. Asking was routine. Refusing to help when help was needed was what actually damaged a reputation. A basket passed hand to hand across a low fence. A door left unlatched for whoever might need it. A quiet nod exchanged instead of thanks. A share of bread broken and handed over without being asked twice. Most people assume medieval poverty was a solitary experience. It rarely was. A widow struggling entirely alone was unusual specifically. because a village organized itself to prevent exactly that outcome: shared plowing teams, communal grazing land, informal grain reserves. None of it charity exactly. All of it insurance nobody ever called by that name. The arrangement worked because everyone understood, without needing it explained, that misfortune rotated. This year's lender was, sooner or later, next year's borrower. A single failed harvest could break a family. It rarely broke a village. That difference, quiet and unglamorous as it was the whole point of living so close to people who remembered every debt in both directions, for as long as memory itself lasted. A hand passing something small from one palm to another without looking down. The soft give of old leather, worn thin at the seams. Firelight catching dust in the air above a table scrubbed pale by decades of use. A door settling on its frame for the night. Everything covered so far might sound like hardship stacked on hardship. Underneath it, though, ran something quieter. A system of knowledge so completed, rarely needed to be written down at all. Nobody handed a child a book explaining how to read the sky before a hailstorm, or how to judge whether a bruise sat over broken bone. That knowledge moved differently through hands, through repetition, through growing up beside people who already knew it. When medieval courts needed to settle a dispute over local custom, grazing rights, boundary lines, who owed what to whom, there was usually no written law to consult. Instead, a jury of the oldest villagers present was asked to simply remember what had always been done for as long as anyone alive could recall. A person could be called into a manor court not for what they had done, but for what they remembered, their word alone standing in for a law that existed nowhere on paper. Memory itself carried the weight of law. A modern parent might worry about which school, which program, which skill a child needs by a certain age. A medieval household had one curriculum, taught by necessity, and everyone eventually passed it. A small hand copying the exact angle of a larger one on a sickle. Eyes tracking a bird's flight before a storm, the way an elder's had just done. A child's fingers pressed lightly to a bruise, testing, then pressing again. A pause, a correction, a nod, and the lesson moved on. So what happens to a system of law built entirely on memory? Once the people holding that memory are gone, nothing, usually, because it was never held by one person. It lived redundantly in dozens of minds at once, each one a backup for the others, so that losing any single memory rarely meant losing the custom itself, an entire education, and not one page of it. That invisible transmission was only half of what carried a household forward. The other half was smaller and far more physical. Every household kept certain objects that outlasted the people who used them. A well-worn tool, a particular pot blackened by decades of the same fire, and often, quietly, a small pouch of seed kept separate from the rest of the grain, no matter how hungry a household became. Eating it meant no planting next spring. A modern family might keep an heirloom in a drawer, taken out only for guests once or twice a year. This object never rested that long. It went back to work every season. It's worth noting how much a lord's claim could take. Under a due called Harriet, a manor lord was legally entitled to seize a deceased tenant's best animal or possession the moment the tenant died. Often the very ox or cow the family depended on most, taken before grief had even settled into the household. Whatever small object a family chose to protect and pass down instead, quietly, outside any ledger, was chosen precisely because nobody could claim it but them. A cloth bag worn smooth at the drawstring from years of the same fingers pulling it open. A palm cupped beneath it to catch anything spilled. A weight tested by feel alone, checked without looking. The faint rustle of dry seed settling back into place. Picture that pouch on a shelf above a fire. Not grand, not ceremonial. Refilled every harvest without anyone needing reminding why. A parent might press it into a child's hands. The first time that child was old enough to help with the sewing, saying nothing more than which furrow to start with, the seasonal rhythm that shaped a peasant's year, the physical toll that shaped their bodies, the crowded room that shaped their sense of family, the shared risk that shaped their sense of debt. None of it lived in one generation. It moved forward the way that pouch did, hand to hand, without ever once needing a record. Continuity, in a world with so little certainty, was itself a kind of wealth. None of this looked like a static life from a distance. Up close, every year required fresh judgment applied to conditions never quite identical to the one before it. The people living it were not passive. They were quietly, constantly keeping something alive. And now, if you'll allow it. Let the pace of this story slow the way a house settles once every task inside it has finally been set down for the night. There is no more weather to watch, no debt to track, no seed to guard until morning. Imagine that small, worn pouch resting above a fire already dimming, its work done, its only purpose to wait until it's needed again. A door is latched somewhere. A last low murmur fades into breathing, then into stillness. Outside, the fields lie dark and unhurried, patient in a way no clock could measure. You don't have to hold onto anything tonight. Nothing needs deciding. Nothing needs carrying. Just let the day set itself down, the way tools were set down at the end of every long season, ready to be picked up only when it was time. That's where we leave this world tonight, not at its hardest moment, but its quietest one. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this helped you unwind, consider a like or subscribing. Rest well.